Uh, yes, but we might have both had more hair on top of our heads. And you were, I believe, heading the Commission on Equal Opportunity at the time. And I came to your office, and you were friendly then, and I thank you for that. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm going to give a talk about my encounter with this topic. As Dr. Toslu mentioned, I published a book last year called The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims. I'll give more of a presentation of that book tomorrow in the seminar, but I thought that tonight I would sort of speak more about my thoughts about how the topic has really changed in the time since I first came to interview Professor Leuven more than a decade ago. I began researching religious minorities in Europe in 1998, and when I first began these interviews, I was actually in Berlin, and I found that all of my interlocutors, all of the offices I went to see, pointed me actually not towards any kind of religion offices or religious administrators, but rather I was pointed always to the immigration officials and to the immigrant integration offices. And this was an issue that came up repeatedly when I was speaking with politicians, with civil servants, and with local community leaders from the Muslim communities. And the main obstacle to Islam and to Muslims being treated as something of Europe or of Germany or of Belgium, of France, the Netherlands, etc., was quite a simple reason. It had to do with foreign nationality, right? Because so few adults within Europe's Muslim population had the local nationality, the European nationality, but also many hundreds of thousands of children did not have European nationalities. If you remember that the German citizenship law granted citizenship mainly by descent and not by birth on the German territory up until the year 2000, so children also had foreign nationality, and this set them, of course, socially apart to a certain extent, but it set them apart politically and administratively as well. And that was, just a very basic obstacle to integration and a very basic obstacle to Islam being treated as a European religion, like the same extent that Catholicism or Protestantism or Judaism or even Hinduism and Buddhism had come to be treated by that time. Besides foreign nationality, the second issue was that the structure or the infrastructure of Islam in Europe was also imprinted by foreignness, which is to say that the imams who were sent to work in various European countries, many hundreds of them, whether being sent from Morocco or from Turkey, or coming via other countries, having studied in Tunisia or studied in Saudi Arabia, and sent to work in Western Europe, these imams, but also the language teachers, the religion teachers who were being sent to work with the children who were born here, were also not from Europe, right? So they were very much imprinted by having a foreign culture and really a foreign language, and they were not very well versed in the local cultures and the local languages. Now this met some resistance, as you will undoubtedly recall, just over the past 10 years, because the reputation was that the infrastructure of Islam in Europe, whether it was about the personnel, so imams, teachers, or the places that they were taught, whether it was in mosques or foreign-run schools, was that Islam simply remained something foreign. In the worst case, there were also instances where mosques or Saudi-run schools, for example, were actually used to foment extreme positions that were at odds with European societies. Now, in some ways, there was nothing that could really be done directly to shape this landscape at the time, at around the turn of this century, in the early 2000s. Of course, foreign imams who preached hatred or engaged in hate speech could, of course, be deported. We see that still occasionally happening in France when someone sort of goes off the rails. But besides deportation, there was not a lot that could be done because so many of Europe's Muslims lived outside of the European nationalities. And Islam as well, also, just like many Muslims, lived outside of the usual regulations and support systems that each European country has to support religious communities and to recognize religious communities and grant them the same rights and privileges that historical religious communities enjoy in these democracies. Now, so much has changed since then, right, that it's really worth sort of reflecting on it and appreciating just how much progress has been made in the last 12 years, even though there is clearly a lot of progress that still remains to be made. Part of the reason why things change so much has to do with the way in which political violence impacted this story, right? So the incidents of terrorism, of course, in 2001, in 2004, in 2005, really changed the mentality that a lot of European politicians, but also European publics, had towards this religion. And I think really increased the impulse to help make both the people practicing the religion, which is to say Europe's newest citizen groups, as well as the religion itself, more of the place that the people were living and the religion was being practiced. To take one case of Germany, which is a very important case where obviously there are now as many as 4 million Muslims living in the German Federal Republic. That's probably around a quarter of all of the Muslims living in Western Europe. There was a big change in 1999 with the red-green government that was voted in and which changed the citizenship law. Right? So one of these main obstacles to Muslims and Islam being part of the political institutions and the political landscape was overcome, right? So that the nationality law was changed so that if you were born in Germany to at least one parent who had been living legally in the country for more than 5 years, then you would automatically receive German citizenship. And that was very different from what had been taking place for the previous 40 years, right? Where you could be born and raised and go to school in Germany and know nothing about Germany and still only have essentially a permanent residence permit, but not the citizenship. Over time, many other countries also made access to citizenship more flexible, liberalized this policy, and interestingly, the German law, which did liberalize and allow for double citizenship actually for the first 23 years of a person's life, that law is now finally taking effect. Right, so that just this year we've had the first cases of young, in this case it's been young Turkish Germans, who are being asked to choose at the age of 23 between their parents' nationality and the nationality that they received at birth. And that, of course, is quite unproblematic for some people. It's very obvious with their choices. For others, it's a little bit more of a question mark. And for others, it's something that they don't even think about, right? And there was a famous case earlier, just in the last month, of a young woman who was a bit late filing her paperwork, or actually it might have even been the Turkish authorities who were a bit late in filing their paperwork. But even though she had chosen the German citizenship, because the Turkish one had not been withdrawn in time, her German citizenship was actually withdrawn. So I don't mean to suggest that somehow there was a magic wand waved, a decade ago that sort of, made all of these technical legal issues go away. They're very much with us still. But what did happen at the beginning of the 2000s was a real shift in mentality. And part of it had to do with the incidents of political violence I mentioned, terrorism, whether it was 9/11 or the 7/7 in London or the 3/11 in Madrid. But part of it had to do with the fact that you simply had younger generations, second, third generations coming up through the schools who were left without any framework for getting to know their culture, right? And you could say, well, in a completely uninterventionist state, that wouldn't really matter, but of course many European states are not uninterventionist when it comes to state-church relations. And there are various administrative possibilities to have your religious community recognized, to have teachers even paid for partially by the state to teach religion classes, and so on. I imagine you're all familiar with a lot of this. And over time, if you look sort of at a snapshot of the way parliaments looked, local parliaments, but also national parliaments, at the end of the 1990s versus the way they look right now, you can, I think, acknowledge that there is a sort of slow diversification of the political class. Now again, it is proportionate to the relatively small percentage of Muslims living in each country, and it reflects also the same difficulties that any immigrant group has in finding political representation, because the earlier generations may be less likely to register to vote, maybe less likely to vote, but nonetheless we see these slow changes in the German Bundestag. There are now 6 or 7 deputies who have various Muslim backgrounds. Of course, you can look in the House of Commons in London. You can even look now in the Assemblée Nationale in Paris, which was perhaps the last bastion of holding out, which with the elections that brought François Hollande to the presidency last year. In the subsequent parliamentary elections, there were a number of second, third generation, either of Algerian descent, who finally made their way into parliament. In addition to this political process, though, and this is something that, and this is the part where I've sort of focused my research on, you've also seen the development of a patchwork of state-Islam relations. Right? You can call it mosque-state relations, you can call it state-church relations. It all amounts to essentially the same thing, which is the formal entry into negotiation with the state and representatives of a religious community, with the ultimate aim of granting that religious community the same rights and recognition and support as existing religious communities. So now, again, if you look across the sort of broad landscape of Western Europe, you'll see that there are local and national consultations. Right here in Belgium, it started quite early in the mid-1990s with the Exécutif Musulman. This was followed in France with the Conseil Français du Culte Musulman, in Italy with the Consulta Islamica, in Germany with the Islam Conference, in the Netherlands with the Contactoran, in Spain with the new Consejo Islámico. Really, in every country you find these interesting bodies which are no longer simply the consultation of local authorities with the embassy of the largest immigrant group, right? That's the way it used to be done. It used to be that if you wanted to have an imam in your community, if you wanted to have a language teacher or a religion teacher, this was all essentially handled through your parents' embassy, right, or your grandparents' embassy. And the big sea change that took place really in the last 15, 20 years was that we saw diversification of the interlocutors that state representatives engaged. So it wasn't only the indirect representatives of the countries of origin who had a say in what kind of Islam was practiced, but it was also then local NGOs, umbrella federations of hundreds of prayer spaces unaffiliated with the home country, and perhaps affiliated with international movements. You can think of the FIOE, which is based in the UK, the Federation of Islamic Organizations in Europe, which has branches in 20 different countries, including the UOIF in France, the UCOI in Italy. And in addition, not only were these non-state actors brought into the discussion about what kind of Islam should be practiced, but so were sort of various individual experts, intellectuals, sometimes there were converts, but the group of people that states spoke to about Islamic affairs became much bigger and much more diverse. The outcome of that is actually pretty impressive, right? I think that we generally have the impression that this is a rather difficult time to be a Muslim in Western Europe, that there's a lot of pressure coming from the political parties to practice a certain kind of Islam, to avoid certain kinds of impression. But if you look at the expansion, actually the expansion of religious freedoms across Europe, it's pretty impressive, right? So at the same time that you have legislation restricting the use, the wearing of headscarves, or the same time you have, these debates about, whether or not halal food can be served to non-Muslims, this kind of thing. You also have this impressive expansion of prayer spaces for Muslims across the continent. So even in France, under the Sarkozy years, right, which everyone I think would agree, the first thing you think about when you think about President Sarkozy is not, a kind of friendliness to Islam. In fact, we saw hundreds of prayer spaces open up in France while he was president. We saw the introduction of supplementary education for imams. We saw the opening of the first Muslim schools on French territory, and the signing of contracts to open Islamic theology faculties. Right? And that's not just France, but of course in Germany we see the same thing. There are now 9 different universities in Germany where you can either study to become an Islamic theologian, you can study to become a teacher of Islamic religion, or you can simply study as one of your faculties. And so this is sort of an interesting paradox, if you like, that at the same time that we have this sort of somewhat poisonous political atmosphere, that administratively a lot of progress has been made, especially when you compare a snapshot of today to a snapshot of 15 years ago. Even as we have now really dozens or perhaps even hundreds of imams and teachers and theologians being trained in Europe,